Welcome to a classic clash from New York, featuring the legendary José Raul Capablanca against Israel Horowitz in a fascinating strategic battle filled with sacrifices and brilliant endgame technique. The game opens with a very symmetrical setup. Both players develop their knights and stake claims in the center, leading to a quiet, solid position with all to play for. Both sides continue their development, fianchettoing their bishops and tucking their kings away safely. The pieces are all on the board, and the real fight is just about to begin. After maneuvering his pieces into place, Black makes the first break in the center with the pawn pushed to e5. White immediately challenges this, capturing on d5 and opening up the position, and Horowitz finds the only move to keep his advantage, recapturing on d5 with the pawn. Here's the brilliant idea. If White pushes the pawn to e4, Black can simply take on e4. The knight recaptures on e4, but after knight takes knight, Black is simply winning a piece. A quiet phase follows as both players improve their rooks. White brings a rook to the c-file, while Black calmly prepares with a little pawn move to h6. And here, Capablanca lets a real opportunity slip. He has a chance to seize the initiative, but he misses it. The stronger try was a central pawn push, pawn to e4. And after bishop to h7, pawn takes pawn on d5, bishop takes the pawn on d3, and rook to c3. White has a clear edge. But in the game, Capablanca plays the quiet knight to f1 and the advantage swings back to Black. Horowitz immediately pounces, pinning the knight with bishop to b4. White is forced to trade, and after a rook move from Black, the bishops come off the board. And this is superb technique. The queen recaptures on b4, the only move that maintains Black's advantage and keeps the pressure on White. White tries to create complications, maneuvering the knight to e3 and the queen to a1, but Black meets the threats head-on, pushing the pawn to d4, a brilliant move from Capablanca. Rook to c1 is a stunning exchange sacrifice, giving up material to seize complete control of the crucial c-file. Horowitz accepts the challenge, and the rook takes the rook on c2, and the knight recaptures on c2, the perfect follow-up and the only move that makes the sacrifice work. The position is now incredibly complex. The queen shifts to d6, and after White plays pawn to e3, the central pawns are traded, clarifying the tension in the center. Another incredibly precise move. The knight takes the pawn on e3, the one and only way to keep the position in a delicate balance. Wow! A brilliant counter-sacrifice from Horowitz. Knight to g4 gives back a piece to completely disrupt White's coordination. And look at the point. After knight to c4, the queen can now take the pawn on d3. The rook moves to d1, but queen to c2 follows, and Black is winning a pawn. Capablanca accepts the sacrifice, and the knight takes the knight on g4, and the bishop recaptures on g4. Once again, this is the only move for Black to keep the balance after his daring sacrifice. After that tactical explosion, the pieces reposition. The queen moves to c3, rooks shuffle, and the knight drops back as both sides prepare for the next battle. Absolutely incredible. Capablanca plays queen to c6, a third brilliant sacrifice. He offers up his queen to liquidate into a completely winning endgame. Black has no choice but to take the queen, and after the rook recaptures on c6, we enter an endgame where White's pieces are fantastically active, dominating the board. This is Capablanca at his best. He methodically improves his position, maneuvering his bishop from c4 to b5, tying Black's pieces down. The endgame grind continues. The white knight joins the attack, hopping to c4, while the rook terrorizes Black from a7. The pressure is immense. And another brilliant move. Rook to a6 prepares to infiltrate on the back rank and poses impossible problems for Black to solve. Black is forced to capture the knight on c4, but the pawn recaptures, creating a monster-passed pawn that will be a constant threat. In a tough position, Black makes a defensive slip. The defense was incredibly difficult, but there was a better way to hold on. The best try was pawn to h5. Then, after pawn to h4, rook to b7, rook to a8 check, and king to e7, Black is still fighting. Instead, in the game, Horowitz plays king to c8, which allows White's rook to become a decisive force. And Capablanca is ruthless, immediately playing rook to a8 with a punishing check. Excellent defense from Horowitz. King to b7 is the only move that keeps him in the game, though the position is still desperate. Now we see Capablanca's legendary technique. His rooks coordinate perfectly, winning the e5 pawn and completely tightening the grip on the position. The squeeze continues. The white bishop and king work in perfect harmony, restricting Black's pieces and leaving him with no good moves. And now, pawn to f4. Capablanca opens up a new front, forcing Black to defend weaknesses all over the board. Under relentless pressure, Black slips again. He needed to find a very precise defensive move to have any chance. The best defense was rook to e7. After pawn to a3, pawn to f6, rook to e4, and king to c7, the fight goes on. But after the move in the game, king to d8, white's advantage grows to a completely winning one. Capablanca's attack is now coming from all sides. His king marches up the board, and a pawn break with b4 shatters black's queenside structure. White consolidates on the queenside and then opens yet another front with the pawn push to h4. Black simply has too many fires to put out, and another inaccuracy from black, who is struggling to find a plan. A different pawn move was required here. Pawn to g5, pawn takes pawn on g5, pawn takes pawn on g5, pawn takes pawn on g5, knight takes pawn on g5. But in the game, pawn to h5 is played, and this allows white's bishop to find a killer square. The white bishop moves to c6 and then lands on the monster d5 square, completely paralyzing black's remaining pieces. This is a critical error. Retreating the knight allows white's most powerful piece, the king, to enter the game decisively. The rook had to stay active. The only chance was rook to a7. After king to d2, knight to c7, bishop to c6, and knight to e6, black is still defending. But after the move played, knight to f8, the floodgates are about to open, and here comes the king. The white king marches to d4, and it's all but over. The king steps to d6, but it's another mistake under pressure. This move does nothing to stop white's unstoppable invasion. The rook swings over to a3, preparing to deliver the final blows. A last desperate check from the knight on e6 is easily sidestepped by the white king, which moves to d3, and the knight retreats to f8. This is the final decisive error, allowing a simple forced sequence for white to win more material. Capablanca plays his final move. It is completely winning, but there was an even more crushing continuation available. The most precise was rook to a6. After knight to d7, bishop to f7, king to c6, the bishop simply takes the pawn on g6, and the game is over. In the game, though, Capablanca plays rook to a8, and this is more than enough to force resignation. And with that, Horowitz resigned. White wins. Black is down a pawn with a completely paralyzed position, and there's no way to stop white's king and rook from creating unstoppable threats. Here's just one example of what he saw. The king would step to e7, the rook swings to a6, the knight moves to d7. The king marches forward to d4, and after rook to c8, black's position completely collapses.